They say that loyalty can't be measured in miles or counted in days. But on a gray morning in March, when James Mitchell had to say goodbye to the only family he had left, he discovered that some bonds run so deep they can survive prison walls, impossible distances, and even the weight of unforgivable mistakes. What started as a desperate act of trust between neighbors would become a miracle that no one saw coming. A story of healing that would prove that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in our darkest moments. Before we begin this incredible journey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story touches your soul, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't believe what happens next. The courthouse steps felt like they stretched for miles beneath James Mitchell's feet as he descended them for the last time as a free man. At 42, James had the calloused hands of someone who had spent his life working with horses, training them, healing them, understanding them in ways that most people could never comprehend. His weathered face bore the lines of too many sleepless nights, and his dark eyes carried a weight that had nothing to do with the 12-month sentence he'd just received. The crime had been stupid, reckless, born from desperation and pride in equal measure, an unpaid debt to the wrong people, a confrontation that went too far, assault charges that even his public defender couldn't minimize. James didn't deny what he'd done. He had stood before the judge with his shoulders squared and his head high, accepting responsibility for his actions, even as his heart shattered at the thought of what his punishment would cost him. Not his freedom. He could survive a year behind bars, not his reputation. That had been damaged long before this. What terrified him was leaving behind Thunder, the magnificent gray stallion that had been his constant companion for the last 8 years. Thunder was more than just a horse. He was James's partner, his therapist, his reason for getting up every morning when the darkness threatened to pull him under. They had found each other in the aftermath of James's divorce, two broken souls who somehow fit together perfectly. James had rescued Thunder from a neglectful owner who kept him penned in a muddy paddock barely large enough to turn around in. And in return, Thunder had saved James from the bottle and the depression that had nearly destroyed him. Now, as James walked the 3 miles from the courthouse back to his small property on the outskirts of town, every step felt like a betrayal. Thunder was waiting at the fence when he arrived, the stallion's intelligent gray eyes seeming to sense that something was terribly wrong. At 17 hands high, Thunder was the impressive sight, his dappled gray coat gleaming like polished silver in the weak afternoon sun, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his skin as he tossed his head in greeting. James pressed his forehead against Thunder's warm neck and felt the tears he'd been holding back all day finally break free. "I'm so sorry, boy," he whispered. "I'm so damn sorry." He had 1 week before he had to report to the county correctional facility. 1 week to find someone who could care for Thunder, someone he could trust with the most precious thing in his life. The problem was James didn't have many friends left. Years of drinking and self-destruction had burned most of those bridges, and the few people who might have helped didn't have the space or resources to care for a high-maintenance horse like Thunder. It was on the 3rd day of his desperate search that James noticed his neighbor, Sarah Chen, watching from her back porch. Sarah had moved into the small farmhouse next to his property about 6 months ago with her 7-year-old son, Ethan. James had exchanged polite waves with her but had never really spoken to her beyond basic pleasantries. He knew she was a widow, raising Ethan alone after losing her husband in a car accident 2 years prior. He'd seen the boy a few times, always in a wheelchair, always silent. But he'd never asked about it, respecting the privacy of their grief. Now, as Sarah approached the fence line, James saw something in her expression that made him pause. It wasn't pity exactly, more like understanding, as if she recognized the particular shape of his despair because she'd carried something similar herself. "I heard about your situation," Sarah said without preamble. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the faint trace of an accent that suggested she'd grown up somewhere far from this small Montana town. "The whole town's been talking about it. I know you're looking for someone to care for your horse." James felt his face flush with shame. Of course, everyone knew. In a town this small, your mistakes became public property the moment the gavel fell. "I am," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I can't pay much. I've got a little saved up, enough for feed and basic vet care, but—" "I'm not asking for money," Sarah interrupted. She glanced back at her house, where James could see Ethan's wheelchair positioned near the window. The boy's small face pressed against the glass. "I'm asking if your horse is gentle." James followed her gaze and understood immediately what she wasn't saying. "Thunder's the gentlest soul you'll ever meet," he said honestly. "He's big, but he's got the temperament of a therapy horse. He's patient, intuitive, and he's never once acted aggressively, even when he was being mistreated before I got him." Sarah nodded slowly, still looking at her son. "Ethan was in the car when his father died," she said quietly. "He hasn't spoken a word since the accident. The trauma damaged something in his brain, they said, and the impact injured his spine. The doctors say he'll never walk again, that the nerve damage is too severe. But more than that, he's locked inside himself. Every specialist we've seen, every therapy we've tried, nothing reaches him. He just sits and stares like he's still trapped in that moment when everything changed." She turned back to James, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "But yesterday, when I brought him outside for some fresh air, he watched your horse for almost an hour. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I saw something in his eyes that I haven't seen in 2 years. Interest, maybe even hope. So I'm offering you a deal, James Mitchell. You let Thunder stay on my property while you're gone, and I'll care for him like he's my own. No payment necessary. All I ask is that maybe, just maybe, your horse can do for my son what all the doctors and therapists couldn't." James felt his throat tighten. It was more than he'd dared hope for, an answer to a prayer he hadn't even known how to form. But more than that, it was a purpose for Thunder, a way for his beloved horse to do what he did best: heal broken souls. "Deal," he said, extending his hand across the fence. Sarah's grip was firm and warm, the handshake of someone making a promise she intended to keep. The next 4 days were a blur of activity. James moved Thunder's things to Sarah's property: his feed buckets, grooming supplies, favorite blanket, the medical kit James had assembled over the years. He walked Sarah through Thunder's routine, his likes and dislikes, the way he preferred his hay dampened slightly, how he loved having his ears scratched but hated having his face touched too roughly. Sarah listened intently, taking notes, asking smart questions that told James she was taking this responsibility seriously. On his last morning as a free man, James woke before dawn and walked to Sarah's property to say goodbye to Thunder. The stallion was waiting at the fence, as if he'd known James would come. For a long time, James just stood there with his arms wrapped around Thunder's powerful neck, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and hay and home. "You be good for Sarah and Ethan," he whispered. "Help them, Thunder, the way you helped me. Show them that healing is possible, even when everything seems broken beyond repair." Thunder blew softly through his nostrils, and James could have sworn the horse understood every word. What James couldn't know as he walked away for the last time, was that Thunder was about to embark on the most important work of his life. On the first day after James left, Sarah brought Ethan out to meet Thunder properly. The boy was thin and pale, his small body seeming to disappear into his wheelchair, his dark eyes empty of everything except the distant echo of trauma. Sarah wheeled him close to the paddock fence, close enough to see Thunder, but far enough to feel safe. Thunder approached slowly, his massive head lowered, his movements careful and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away and simply stood there, gray eyes fixed on the silent child. For 5 minutes, neither of them moved. Then Thunder took a single step forward, stretched out his neck, and gently pressed his nose against Ethan's small hand where it rested on the wheelchair's armrest. Sarah gasped, ready to pull Ethan back if he showed any sign of fear. But the boy didn't flinch. Instead, for the first time in 2 years, his fingers moved. Slowly, hesitantly, like someone remembering a language they'd almost forgotten. Ethan's hand lifted from the armrest and touched Thunder's soft muzzle. "Ethan," Sarah breathed, tears streaming down her face, but she forced herself to stay quiet, not wanting to break whatever spell was unfolding before her eyes. Thunder stood perfectly still, letting the boy explore his face with tentative fingers. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for an animal so large, the stallion lowered his head even further and rested it carefully in Ethan's lap. And Ethan, silent for 730 days, opened his mouth and made a sound. It wasn't a word, just a soft exhalation that carried the ghost of wonder, but to Sarah it might as well have been a symphony. From that moment on, Thunder and Ethan were inseparable. Every morning, Sarah would wheel Ethan out to the paddock, and Thunder would be waiting. The horse would lower his head for the boy to pet, would stand perfectly still while Ethan traced the whorls in his coat, would blow gentle breaths against the child's face that made Ethan's lips twitch in what almost looked like a smile. By the end of the first week, Ethan was making regular sounds, small vocalizations that weren't quite words but suggested that speech might be returning. By the end of the second week, Sarah began bringing Ethan into the paddock itself, and Thunder would lie down in the grass so the boy could lean against his warm bulk. But something else was happening too. Something that Sarah noticed, but couldn't quite explain. Every afternoon at exactly 2:30, Thunder would leave the paddock and walk to the far edge of Sarah's property, to the place where the fence line ran closest to the county correctional facility about half a mile away. The horse would stand at the fence for exactly 1 hour, his body oriented toward the distant prison walls, his ears pricked forward as if listening for something only he could hear. At first, Sarah thought it was just coincidence. But when it happened every single day, always at the same time, always for the same duration, she realized what was happening. Thunder was keeping his vigil, maintaining his connection to James across the distance that separated them. Inside the correctional facility, James had fallen into the numbing routine of prison life. He worked in the kitchen, kept his head down, marked days off on a calendar he'd made from torn notebook paper. But every afternoon at 2:30, he would stop whatever he was doing and stand at the small window of his cell block, looking out toward the direction of Sarah's property. He couldn't see Thunder from there. The distance was too great. But somehow he felt the horse's presence, felt the unwavering loyalty that bridged the space between them. The other inmates noticed his daily ritual and gave him grief about it at first, but eventually they left him alone. Even hardened criminals understood the kind of love that transcended walls and wire. Meanwhile, Ethan's progress was accelerating in ways that defied medical explanation. After a month with Thunder, he spoke his first word, horse. It came out rough and uncertain, but Sarah cried for an hour after hearing it. After 2 months, he was speaking in short sentences, his voice getting stronger each day. But the real miracle came 3 months into James's sentence. Sarah had brought Ethan out for his morning session with Thunder as usual. The boy was leaning against Thunder's side, telling the horse a rambling story about something he'd seen on television, when Thunder suddenly stood up. Ethan started to protest, but Thunder walked a few steps away and then turned back, looking at the boy with clear expectation. "What is it, Thunder?" Ethan asked. His speech had improved so much that he now sounded almost like any other 7-year-old. Thunder took another step away and looked back again. "I think he wants you to follow him," Sarah said, her heart beginning to race with an intuition she didn't dare name. "But I can't walk, Mom," Ethan said matter-of-factly. He'd accepted his disability with the pragmatism of childhood. Thunder walked back to Ethan, lowered his head, and gently bumped the boy's chest with his nose. Then he did it again, and again. Each bump was careful but insistent, and Sarah suddenly understood what the horse was trying to communicate. "Ethan," she said, her voice shaking, "I want you to try something for me." "Try to stand up, just try. Thunder will help you." "Mom," the doctor said. "I know what they said. But Thunder doesn't care about what doctors say. He believes you can do this. So do I. Will you try? For Thunder?" Ethan looked up at the massive gray horse standing before him, at the intelligent eyes that seemed to hold nothing but absolute confidence. And something shifted in the boy's face, some internal decision being made. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll try." Thunder positioned himself directly in front of Ethan's wheelchair and lowered his head until it was level with the boy's chest. Sarah held her breath, not daring to hope, as Ethan gripped Thunder's mane with both small hands. "On 3, Ethan said, his voice surprisingly steady. 1, 2, 3. The boy pushed himself forward, using Thunder's solid presence as an anchor, and to Sarah's shock, his feet touched the ground. His legs were shaking, muscles that hadn't been used in 2 years, struggling to remember their purpose. But Thunder stood absolutely still, a living pillar of strength, and Ethan didn't fall. For 10 seconds, Ethan stood on his own 2 feet, trembling but upright. Then his legs gave out, and Sarah rushed forward to catch him, lowering him gently back into his wheelchair. Both mother and son were crying, but they were tears of astonishment rather than grief. "I stood up," Ethan said wonderingly. "Mom, I stood up." "You did, baby." "You really did," From that day forward, Ethan practiced standing every morning and every afternoon, always with Thunder as his support. The horse seemed to understand exactly how much weight the boy could bear, adjusting his position to provide more or less support as needed. Within a week, Ethan could stand for a full minute. Within 2 weeks, he took his first step. The doctors were baffled when Sarah brought Ethan in for an emergency evaluation. The nerve damage that had seemed permanent was somehow healing. The muscles that had atrophied were rebuilding themselves. "It's medically impossible," one specialist said. "But I'm looking at it, so it must be real." Sarah didn't try to explain about Thunder. She knew they wouldn't believe her. By James's 9th month in prison, Ethan could walk 20 steps with Thunder beside him. By the 10th month, he could walk the length of the paddock. By the 11th month, he was running, and every single day at 2:30, Thunder still walked to the far edge of the property and kept his vigil, standing at the fence, looking toward the prison where James counted down his final days. The morning of James's release, Sarah woke up before dawn and stood at her kitchen window, watching Thunder in the pre-dawn darkness. The horse was pacing the fence line, more agitated than she'd ever seen him, as if he could sense that something important was about to happen. "Today's the day, isn't it, boy?" she whispered. At 9 a.m., James Mitchell walked out of the county correctional facility, a free man. He'd served every day of his sentence, used the time to complete substance abuse counseling and anger management classes, and emerged leaner and harder, but somehow more grounded than he'd been going in. The counseling had been mandatory, but it had also been necessary, helping him understand the patterns of behavior that had led to his downfall. His first thought was to get to Thunder. He'd arranged for a friend to pick him up and drive him to Sarah's property, and the 20-minute drive felt like it took hours. When they finally pulled up to Sarah's farmhouse, James was out of the car before it fully stopped. Thunder was at the far fence, at his usual 2:30 vigil spot, even though it was only 9:30. But the moment the horse saw James, he let out a piercing whinny that could probably be heard for miles. He reared up on his hind legs, not in aggression but in pure joy, then took off at a gallop, racing across the paddock toward the main gate where James stood. James was crying openly as he fumbled with the gate latch. And then Thunder was there, pushing his massive head against James's chest, nearly knocking him over with the force of his greeting. "I missed you too, boy," James sobbed, wrapping his arms around Thunder's neck. "God, I missed you so much." They stood like that for a long time, man and horse reunited. The bond between them not diminished, but somehow strengthened by the separation they'd endured. Finally, Sarah's voice broke through his emotion. "James, there's someone who wants to meet you properly." James looked up and saw Sarah standing on her porch. And beside her, not in a wheelchair but standing on his own 2 feet, was a small boy with dark hair and bright eyes. James's mouth fell open. That's Ethan?" "Hi, Mr. Mitchell," Ethan said clearly, his voice strong and confident. "Thunder told me all about you." James looked from the boy to Sarah to Thunder and back again, trying to process what he was seeing. "You're walking. Sarah said you couldn't." "Thunder taught me," Ethan said simply, as if it explained everything. And in a way, it did. Sarah walked down from the porch, and James saw that she was crying too. "I tried to tell you in my letters, but I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. The doctors certainly don't. They call it a spontaneous remission, a 1 in a million chance. But I know the truth. Thunder healed my son, James." He gave Ethan back his voice and his legs and his hope. He did for Ethan exactly what you asked him to do. Ethan walked over to Thunder and wrapped his arms around the horse's front leg, the highest he could reach. "Thunder visited you every day," the boy said to James. "At 2:30. He never missed, not even once. He said you needed to know he didn't forget you." "Thunder talks to you?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded seriously. "Not with words, but I understand him anyway. He says you're good and kind and that you made a mistake, but mistakes don't mean you're bad. He says he's proud of you for being strong enough to accept your punishment and learn from it." James felt his knees weaken, and he sat down hard on the ground. Thunder immediately lowered his head, and Ethan settled himself against James's side, a small, warm presence that felt like absolution. "I don't deserve this," James said. "I don't deserve either of you." "Thunder says that's dumb," Ethan announced. "He says everyone deserves a second chance, especially people who are trying to be better." Sarah knelt down beside them, James, I have a proposition for you. Ethan's not the only child who needs what Thunder can give. There are other kids out there, kids with trauma, disabilities, illnesses that medicine can't fix. What Thunder did for Ethan, he could do for them. And you, with your training and your understanding of horses, you could help make it happen. We could start a program together, a therapeutic riding center. I've been researching, making plans. I even talked to some investors who are interested in funding it. But I need you. We need you. James looked at Thunder, at Ethan, at Sarah's hopeful face. A year ago, he'd been a broken man heading to prison, convinced his life was over. Now he was being offered not just redemption, but purpose, a chance to turn his biggest mistake into something meaningful. I'm on parole, he said. I'll have restrictions, check-ins, conditions I have to meet. We'll work around them, Sarah said firmly. James, you gave me Thunder when you didn't have to. You trusted me with what you loved most in the world. Let me give something back. Let us build something together that matters. Thunder blew softly through his nostrils and bumped James's shoulder with his nose, as if adding his own vote to Sarah's proposal. When do we start? James asked. Within 6 months, the Healing Hooves Therapeutic Center opened its doors on a piece of property that Sarah had purchased with the help of her investors. Thunder was the star of the program, of course, but they'd added 3 more horses, each carefully selected for their gentle temperaments and intuitive natures. James served as the head trainer, working with both horses and clients to create healing connections. Sarah managed the business side, her organizational skills and determination driving the center's growth. But the heart of the program would always be the bond between Thunder and Ethan. The boy, fully recovered now, spent every afternoon at the center, helping other children find the same healing he'd discovered. He was Thunder's interpreter, explaining to new kids that the big gray horse understood their pain because he'd carried his own scars, that he wouldn't judge them or push them, that he would simply be there, steady and patient, until they were ready to take their next step. The local news picked up the story, then regional papers, then national media. James gave interviews about second chances and the healing power of the human-animal bond. Sarah spoke about trauma recovery and the importance of alternative therapies. Ethan, at 8 years old, became a symbol of hope for families dealing with seemingly impossible medical situations. But James's favorite moments weren't the ones in front of cameras or crowds. They were the quiet afternoons when he'd stand at the fence and watch Thunder work with a new child. Seeing that same patient gentleness the horse had shown Ethan, witnessing the exact moment when a broken child first connected with the magnificent gray stallion and discovered that healing was possible. And every day at 2:30, even though James was no longer behind prison walls, Thunder would pause in whatever he was doing and look toward James, their eyes meeting across the paddock. It was a ritual they'd never broken, a reminder that loyalty and love could survive anything, even the consequences of our worst mistakes. 3 years after James's release, on a bright October morning, the center held a ceremony to celebrate helping their 500th client. Local officials attended, along with families whose children had been transformed by the program. James stood at the front of the crowd with Sarah on one side and Ethan, now 10 years old, on the other. Thunder stood behind them, his gray coat gleaming in the autumn sun, his amber eyes taking in the celebration with what James swore was satisfaction. The mayor gave a speech about community and second chances. A parent whose son had been in a coma for months before Thunder's gentle presence had somehow called him back shared her tearful thanks. Reporters clicked away with their cameras, capturing images that would appear in newspapers across the country. But as the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, James stayed behind, standing alone with Thunder in the center's main paddock. He pressed his forehead against the horse's neck, feeling the familiar warmth, breathing in the scent that meant home. "None of this would exist without you," he said quietly. "I was drowning, Thunder. Going to prison probably saved my life, made me face what I'd become. But you gave me a reason to be better. And then you did the same thing for Ethan, and for all those other kids. How do I even begin to thank you for that?" Thunder blew softly through his nostrils and turned his head to look at James with those wise, ancient eyes. And James, who had spent years learning to understand what his horse couldn't say in words, heard the message as clearly as if Thunder had spoken. "You don't need to thank me. This is what we do. We heal each other." As the sun set over the Healing Hooves Center, casting long shadows across the paddocks where horses and children found their way back to hope. James Mitchell finally understood what true redemption looked like. It wasn't about erasing your mistakes or pretending they never happened. It was about accepting the consequences, learning from the pain, and then using what you'd learned to create something beautiful from the wreckage. He'd gone to prison a broken man with nothing but regrets. He'd come out with a purpose that was bigger than himself, a mission that turned his darkest hour into a foundation for healing others. And he'd done it all because a gray stallion had chosen to love him unconditionally, to stand vigil at a prison fence for 12 months, and to show a silent, wheelchair-bound boy that miracles were real if you believed in them hard enough. Thunder whinnied softly, calling to Ethan, who was playing with some of the other children near the barn. The boy looked up, grinned, and came running over, no trace of the broken child he'd once been. "Race you to the pond?" Ethan challenged Thunder, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Thunder took off at a gallop, deliberately slow enough that Ethan had a chance, and James watched them race across the field together. Boy and horse both healed, both healing others, both proof that second chances were real and love was the strongest medicine in the world. This incredible story of Thunder, James and Ethan, proves that loyalty knows no boundaries, that healing can come from the most unexpected places, and that our worst moments can become the foundation for our greatest purpose. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope and redemption. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of second chances and extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. And let us know in the comments what part of this journey touched your heart the most. Your support helps us continue sharing these life-changing stories with the world.